Manish Sabharwal has been watching what's going on in the economy, in the society, and in the government from multiple vantage points of view. As the chairman of Teamlease, he has been looking at how businesses have been dealing with it. I think he has over 3,500 clients and hired over 1.7 million people over years, Manish.
Yes.
And he's on the board of Reserve Bank of India, and he's a thought leader, has a huge fan following, and I'm one of them. So basically what we hope to do is to kind of get your perspectives on the business from the policy perspective, and see where exactly we are going. Also like to introduce my colleagues. Indrajit Gupta is there, Anmol, and Charles. We also have Satish Pradhan. All of us will be asking questions in the next during the session. So I would like to start, Manish, by asking you, in terms of scenarios, you have been a close observer of how businesses behave during crisis, during normal times, and how exactly do we think about how businesses will behave in the coming weeks and maybe a couple of months as well? If you can start with that, we'll follow up that with our questions.
I think it's unmodelable. I mean, the first input into a GPS is not where you're going, it's where you are. And so if the crisis lifts on 15th April, there will be one set of responses. If the lockdown is lifted, if the lockdown continues beyond 1st May, there will be another set of responses. And if the lockdown continues beyond May or June, this is not in the realm of commercial enterprises. It shifts to the realm of policy. Right? Companies can't do deficit financing. And modern corporations are not ponds, we are rivers, right? I mean, I think that the fundamental misunderstanding among bureaucrats sometimes is that shareholders and lenders pay salary. Customers pay salaries. Shareholders and lenders don't pay salaries, and you can't. So I think the flow has stopped with this lockdown. And obviously, companies with leverage, companies with diversified business models were anyway hurting before the crisis. And this is sort of uncharted territory. So I would say that I think companies, if the lockdown is lifted on 15th April, you could get to life back to normal pretty quickly. I think there will be a spike in labor costs for 15 days in cities because people will take time to come back. But I think many companies, and you will have minimal, it'll be the blessings of a skinned knee, if you call it, if the lockdown is lifted by 15th April. But if it is rolled over to 1st May, then the first round of loss of pay, furloughs, and sort of lockdowns. I mean, fixed costs will have to be adjusted if you have to spend the whole month of April with zero revenues and all your costs. And if it goes beyond May, then it's hard to model, right? So I would say that the crisis has exposed sort of many trade-offs, and these are not conflicts. Many people are sort of positioning this as conflicts between lives and livelihoods, between sort of employers and employees, between, current and future generations, between residents and migrants, between liquidity and solvency. Central banks can't solve solvency problems. They can help with liquidity. And so I think that there are many trade-offs which are second-order effects of this lockdown, which will only be known over the next month or two. But my view is that it is unmodelable till 15th April's lockdown is extended or partially lifted or shut down.
Will we get a better clarity if we kind of look at it more granularly? Maybe there are some industries which has a better sense of what's going on, some industries where the uncertainty is higher. Would you look at it, and how would you look at these? If you can broadly put industries in 3 buckets, where one has a better clarity over the others. Which industries would they be?
I mean, I think that's really hard to do, right? Because it's obviously travel, airlines, restaurants. I mean, the hospitality segment is going to be the last, even if there is a partial down. I mean, multiplexes, malls, retail, construction will be the last to be sort of lifted. So I would say there is obviously an element of sequencing in the lockdown being lifted. But those are the elements also, but those are the industries which also tend to have the highest variable employee cost. So they are the ones who tend to adjust their employees. See, there's a fundamental view among employers. And I would say this lockdown is the mother of all randomized controlled trials based on the different way that countries and organizations and people respond to something like this. So sociologists, anthropologists, entrepreneurs, board members, central banks will be looking back on the different responses that countries had and organizations had and people had. Do they respond with hope? Do they respond with fear? Do they respond with, screwing the future generation? Or do they respond with, some prudence of saying presentism is not fair? Do they respond with the long view and say this is an opportunity? Or do they respond with sort of the wisdom of Warren Buffett, who said that, you have to survive in order to succeed? So, you can talk about, spirituality later, but first you have to survive. So I think that yes, there are some industries with different levels of fixed costs and some with different levels of sort of elasticity in their demand. But I think that if you carry this on beyond May, any amount of granularity will not function. Customers pay salaries, and shareholders and banks don't. And so the right sequence for us is, so everything you do to murder the virus is going to murder the economy. And that is the right sequence. And the right sequence is first deal with the virus, then deal with poor citizens, then deal with the economy, then deal with employers, and then deal with the financial system.
Yes, I hear you, Manish, except that doing this in a staggered manner, as you suggest, do we really have the time? Because the sweep and the deep cuts that we are likely to witness, both in industry, business, across the board, are we really prepared for a staggered response? And what are the pros and cons of following what you're suggesting?
See, I think that, New York couldn't handle being New York. New York has 9 million virus. New York couldn't handle virus-stricken New York. It has 9 million people and a per capita of $93,000. So India couldn't have handled virus-stricken India. We have 1.3 billion people and our per capita income is $2,000. So I think that resource constraints have always existed for poor countries, and they get more amplified in times like this. The US and Europe have offered a total package of about $8 trillion in debt and subsidies to employers over the last month, which is about 2 years of profits. I'm not sure India could even come close to that calibration, right? So, but the question really is to what level do we bust the fisc? To what level do, where you stand on this issue depends on where you sit, right? Whether you're a borrower or you're a lender, whether you are a tenant or whether you're a landlord, and whether you're an employee or whether you're an employer. But if schools don't get fees, teachers don't get paid. And that sort of contradiction has started coming up because 5 states have said we are going to shut, not let schools collect fees. So I think that the nature of this beast is that we're going to have to wing a little bit of it. The sequencing, and there is the list of ingredients is obvious to everybody. There will have to be a monetary response. And central banks can do 3 things. They can reduce interest rates, they can offer regulatory forbearance, and they can offer liquidity to the financial system. Central banks cannot solve solvency problems. And so this is a solvency crisis more than a liquidity crisis. When you have a demand incineration of the kind that a lockdown creates, its first manifestation, and every doctor will tell you don't treat the symptom, treat the disease. The liquidity is just this, one way to solve a headache is to cut off your head, but that may be the wrong diagnosis. So I would submit that liquidity is the wrong diagnosis for this crisis. It's a crisis of solvency. It genuinely is a crisis of solvency. So I think that if it is a 15-day April 15th liftoff, the sequencing will be different and the staggering will have to be different. And I don't disagree with you that if it's beyond May, then we will have to steal from our great-grandchildren, not our grandchildren, to make sure this drama goes on. But I think it would be premature to use all our monetary fiscal powder at this stage before we know whether this is a 1-month lockdown, 3-week lockdown, 2-month lockdown, or maybe 3-month lockdown. Who knows?
Just wanted to pick up the thread and you know, on the last point you made about the sequencing of responses and
Yes.
the ingredient which lends itself to being phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, etc. Do you see a difference in the consequences created in the way we deal with phase 1 kind of ingredient choices? So for example, we're dealing with killing the virus. Are there choices that we have which could impact the range of possibilities available in phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 7 or the 7th ingredient that we would be dealing with? And how do you see that chain of linkages playing out? So that was one. And the second question I had was, inevitably this is going to be a set of dilemmas which involve being in lots of bad places and lots of rocks at the same time. But having said that, policy is a man-made creature.
Yes.
The virus has happened to us is more like a natural disaster or a consequence. It may have linkages to some human triggers, but it's happened to us the way a tsunami would happen. And the way, given climate change, we might be responsible for it, but not the immediate cause. So if we see policy as a response by one of the actors, is there a way of fashioning that response differently?
So sequencing is one of the most interesting things in any reform process, right? I mean, but sometimes, you know, policymakers aren't always the chef. Sometimes they are the waiter in the restaurant because of the concept of policy windows. You know, Kingdons, as a political scientist, says policy windows open and close. I don't think India would have been ready for a 21-day lockdown before the date it was announced. You know, you needed cases to rise, you needed panic to set in. You know, fertile soil for policy receptiveness to pain often has preconditions. And so if you announce something prematurely, there is some such thing as civil disobedience. You know, people are saying that, what the hell? I don't think this is, you know, it's such a draconian measure was needed. And even when it was announced, people felt that 21 days was too much. But I think that the nature of policy sequencing is also dependent, emerges as you go along. So I think that the pictures of the you know, migrants going back home has influenced policy substantially in how they think about the lockdown being unwound. You know, you know, it will influence. So I think that the sequencing of policy, there is a fog of war. You know, the directives are made on the fly. You know, John Keegan, he was a military historian. He used to say the most important thing for a leader during a crisis is to keep the mask of command. But it is important for leaders to remember it is a mask. And we, you know, so there is a mask of command in government. And so that's why I said that the nature of political science is you'll prefer, democracy will always choose being poor over being dead in the first phase, because you tried that. Right, and then when poor gets to the point that it's leading to dead, then you will change the sequence a little more, because then the public is a little more open to different kinds of calculations. So I would say my sequence of, or at least my proposed sequence of saying that first we deal with the virus, then we deal with poor citizens, then we deal with the economy, then we deal with employers, and then we deal with the financial system, is purely a recognition, almost as a caste system, of what an unschooled mind would consider important, you know, and at some point employers will come ahead, or, you know, without employers, there are no employees. But today bureaucrats think that shareholders pay salaries, not customers. Now, for larger companies, that's not true, but for smaller companies, that's not true at all. You know, they are flow, they are not stock. So I think that for the policy environment to recognize that the consequences of not choosing employers earlier enough, we're not there yet. We will get there very quickly. So all I'm saying is that we should use these two gating dates as 15th April and 1st May to then decide, because if you're going beyond 15th April, suddenly so much that was not on the table for employers becomes real and urgent and overdue. But if you end on 15th April, then, you know, there will be a stock to cover, but it will not be seen as a perpetual item. So I think that my case to you would be is that the sequencing is also decided on the fly.
Should we also look at the country not as a monolith, but as there are districts where there are high levels of infections, and there are districts which are basically infection free as of today, but we don't know because the government has said Supreme Court told Supreme Court that 30% of the migrants might be infected. So we don't know how the image is emerging. But is there a possibility of green zones and red zones, and if a business, what does it mean for businesses which are in green zone versus businesses which are in red zone? Do you see that as a emerging scenario as well? Is that likely to happen?
I mean, I think it depends on the randomized control trial on whether cities can function without migrants, right? You know, I think that our case that India can't take jobs to people and needs to take people to jobs has played out in the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, Kerala it has exposed the ovarian lottery, right? Residents of South and West India are much better off than migrants from North and East India, because Bihar and Kerala are both wastelands, right? Economic wastelands. You know, Kerala has 9% of its population outside the country, and 9% of its population is Bihari. Both are because Kerala was an economic wasteland as an exporter, but because it exported overseas, you know, Bihar's economic wasteland was compensated by that. So it's unclear whether Kerala can function without 10 or 15% of its population doing the work. So I think that if you, from a world of work perspective, I think from a human life perspective, absolutely green zones and red zones work. But a world of work perspective, you know, supply chains are national, people's supply chains are national. I think that, so it would be hard to maintain green zones because so much of India is not self-sufficient in all aspects that it needs to be, particularly in terms of labor. So my sense is green zone, red zone could work for a few weeks if we were extending the, I mean, green zone, red zone is basically a partial lockdown or a staggered sort of lift up of the lockdown. But my sense is it would be really hard to restore normalcy with green zones and red zones because economic distress in red zones would migrate to green zones, and you're not going to put the army at borders, or if there are 1 million people who decide to move, there's nothing an army can do anyway.
So Manish, if I were to just come in here for a minute, and a question occurs to me just to build upon this point that you just made. I was in conversation with a private equity investor yesterday, and asking him pretty much the same question, and asked him what's a good, bad, and ugly outcomes as you may see it, and he sounded rather distraught. And his point was that I see only the bad and the ugly. I don't see anything good. And is there, between the lines, if I hear you right, is that what you are insinuating as well?
No, anyway, I think that's a myth that policy choices are good ones. Policy is always choice between bad and worse choices. That's a myth from outside that there are good policy choices, because policy by definition is the world of second best, right? You know, Avinash Dikshit at Princeton always reminds me that life is second best at best in policy. Because best choices are usually have an antibiotic reaction, or it's never a maximization problem, it's an optimization problem. But I believe that if the lockdown can be lifted by 15th April, and that decision is purely medical, then I think we will end up normalizing over the next week, in some places, over the next month in some places, and 3 months overall. But if it continues beyond April, that's why I said that I think it's unmodelable right now, because people can handle certain thresholds of pain. We can handle the blessings of a skinned knee, but we can't handle a broken leg. We can't handle an amputation. And every milestone that you extend the lockdown, I think 14th April is a skinned knee for corporate India and many employers. I think 1st May is a broken leg. I think 15th May is an amputation for many employers, and particularly small ones.
So even within these constraints, do you see any businesses doing the right thing? Within the lockdown, what are the good practices that you see, especially when it comes to engaging with the employees, the workforce? Is there anything that
I think it's hard, yeah. I mean, in my mind, at least, the most important thing the lockdown, the work from home epidemic has exposed is the caste system, right? I mean, 60% of our graduates can work from home, but only 10% of our non-graduates can work from home, right? So if you work with your mind, you can work from home, but if you work with your hands and legs, you can't work from home. And even right now, the jury will be out, right, on people with their minds working from home. I mean, working from home has provided continuity in the last 10 days, but the jury is still out on whether it's delivering productivity. Andrew Carnegie was once asked, how many people work in your company? He said about half. And many CEOs are probably saying that's the right number for work from home. If people were honest, they would apply for leave and saying, I'm not working from home, I'm at home. Many people are, because the pipeline is already running dry. So I think that, in these crises, obviously communicating, but this is not like a normal crisis. We can't, sales pipelines will run dry. There are many activities which have spent the last 10, 15 years doing housekeeping, thinking about long-term stuff. But in another 1 week, all these people will be vela. I mean, they genuinely will have nothing to do. And you can keep them busy by, getting them onto your Zoom calls or stuff like that. But they will, salespeople can spend some time on marketing, they can spend half their day, we'll do all long-term projects. So I would say the best practice right now is just making an assessment for what you will do on 15th April, 1st May and 15th May.
But Manish, if you don't start that process, and you're absolutely right, I think most organizations were certainly not prepared, but what do you think work from home will do to those digital laggards who certainly didn't have a clue of how to transition to work from home in the long run?
Yeah, but nobody, no country or no person changes for a better option. No, you change when you have no option. So I've seen the digital literacy of people who were, not willing to listen, just become completely comfortable. So the only unintended upside of this will be a massive raising of India's digital literacy at all ages, across teachers who were the most resistant across this. So that will be a clear upside here. So I would not underestimate people of this ability to, this has brought forward telemedicine, e-learning and work from home by 15 years.
You think so?
Yeah, I think history doesn't change things. It just accelerates what's happening. A crisis like this doesn't change the trajectory, it just accelerates what's already happening. So e-learning, I mean, schools will really think about the time they allocate between synchronous learning, asynchronous learning, between time submissions and stuff like that. And I think they will be using their Google Classrooms and stuff like that much more than they did. I think for sure, at least in my kids' school, they have said next time there is a bandh, the school will be operating online. They will not get a holiday when there is a Bandh. So they will keep this infrastructure they have built. So I would say, yeah, but I'd say prematurely scaring people with what we will do on 15th April will also be a mistake, no? Because then they will be dying 1,000 cuts between now and 15th April. If the lockdown is lifted on 14th April, then, those plans should stay plans. I mean, so I would say that, people are talking about preparing the organization for an extension beyond 15th April. I mean, that would be needless pain sometimes, right?
But what do you do? I think there's concern that there is no playbook for employee engagement at a time like this, because you have no clue. I mean, what people are doing at home.
But they see through the fraud, no? But they see through the fraud, no? I mean, I think also just mask of commands are very sophisticated masks. If masks of commands come across as being delusional, then, I mean, I think that it is clear that this is uncharted territory. It is clear that you have to survive in order to succeed. And so I think that employers who are saying that don't worry, nothing happens, are also not going to end up being credible when the crisis, if the lockdown extends. So there is a fine balance between being honest and being credible and being sort of compassionate here, which, every leader will have to find their own balance with that one. And every organization and every country, frankly, right, is finding this separates you could also separate optimists from pessimists, right? I mean, there are people who it is becoming obvious their view of the world is that, we will deal with it, or there are merchants of worst case scenario, or what I call people in the buy more tunnel club, right? As soon as there is a light at the end of the tunnel, they have to go and buy more tunnel because they can't handle a light at the end of the tunnel. So I think this crisis has exposed people's worldviews also. But realism versus, that companies, I'm not sure companies should totally be broadcasting what they will do on 15th April or 1st May, because they will be quite brutal. And there's no need to impose. Obviously, the senior leadership team needs to be honest about how long they can last and do stuff. But to impose it on the organization on 1st April on what will happen on 15th April if the lockdown is lifted may be needless pain. I mean, some organizations may choose it, but I think option theory tells us that an option that is free is worth something. So, if 14th April is this massive call or put option on how you view it for corporate India, which will get exercised. And so it's unmodelable.
I think, Manish, you were making the point that companies shouldn't be in a rush to, kind of take decisions. It is more prudent to kind of wait it out and see how things play out, and not, but then, the issue is that anxiety levels are rising and people are talking about an anxiety epidemic. I just wanted you to maybe provide some perspective of what you're seeing from your wanted standpoint.
No, I mean, I think it's obviously there is some such thing as cabin fever. I think there are some mental health challenges, but I think again with mental health challenges, we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. If it stays on, it will come on. So some of this anticipated sort of challenges. We can't provide, no company can provide for the inch wide, mile deep risks. All of us are can live our lives living the mile wide, inch deep risks. If you inch wide, mile deep, if you have to provide 100% latency for peak load handling, if you have to provide for every possible challenge, then no company will be viable and no person will exist, right? So I think my sense is that the mental health challenge or the massive liquidity crisis becoming a solvency crisis depends on 14th April and 1st May. I keep coming back to option theory because, finally, if there's one thing strategy has taught us over the years, it is, not making decisions before you need to. And that's not an argument, that's not lack of ambition. It is when you face uncertainty. If you face risk, see the difference between risk and uncertainty being risk, you can calculate probabilities. But there's no way to calculate probabilities in today's scenario. Risk is you can calculate probabilities. Uncertainties is where you can't. And I think we're in a classic situation where no employer, no employee, no industry, no district magistrate, no state chief minister, and no prime minister can tell you today whether the lockdown will be lifted on 14th April. So now we learn from option theory. We learn from strategy, which is decision making under uncertainty, which say the military has long been used to, or option traders have long been used to. And that tells us that, keep a mask of command, but recognize that the mask is a mask. Recognize that, an option that you don't pay something is worth something. And so I would suggest that, the mental health preparation is really impossible because you can't deliver mental health physically during a lockdown. So can this mental health stuff be delivered online? I mean, the psychologists have been trying that in the US for 10 years, and they have concluded that a large part of their effectiveness is diminished online. Now, is that being brought forward? Were they like teachers who were resisting it and will now change their mind? I don't know. So I would say that, it's unmodelable. We just have to accept that. There's nothing wrong with living for 10 days with anxiety. Because there would be also false anxiety, which would be people are furious if they feel cheated or if they feel misled. In these kind of situations, honesty is sometimes very liberating. And so that's the school of thought I belong to. There may be other people who think differently.
But Manish, I'll just take a specific example because I think there are a few businesses that were anyway in a very, very bad shape even before we got into this current situation, right? Auto was a classic example. Airlines are struggling, and even media. I mean, you've seen some of the moves that have been announced. For those kind of businesses, do you still recommend holding off decision making on salaries and layoffs and all of that, or what some of them? I'm referring specifically to, let's say, what Indian Express just announced a few days ago, where their leadership team essentially decided to take 100% cut, and they had a graded kind of system of pay cuts and resisted the whole temptation to lay off. Now, these questions will come up for debate inside organizations. Where do you kind of lean towards? Between?
I think there is a graded between loss of pay being the first response, furloughs being the next response, and getting rid of next response. But I do think that this whole concept of cutting pays versus cutting people depends on where you are. High performers will prefer, people being cut, and low performers will perform pay being cut. And at this point, we don't need to take either side. But we do need to think about what is the best method that helps us survive. I think that on 15th April, a number of companies will, if the lockdown is extended, will probably adopt the loss of pay for April. On 30th April, if we extend the lockdown, they will move into the realm of furloughs or cutting employees. But I don't think they should announce it on 10th April. I think that would be, they don't have enough information on 10th April on whether they need loss of pay furlough or they need nothing. I mean, maybe they need nothing, right? Maybe, if it goes beyond 15th April, we will announce a very different program than if the lockdown is ended on 15th April, then, we will take a hit. But if it lasts beyond 15th, it is, where is the pain distributed? Is the pain distributed to shareholders? Is the pain distributed to lenders? At what stage does it get distributed to employees? And within employees, does it get distributed unevenly to senior people and junior people, or tenured people and untenured people? There are many algorithms possible. And I think that there will be no right answer to that. It will depend on your personal values. It will depend on, just like, the view of debt as from my RBI perch, many of the 12 companies that we put into bankruptcy, Bhushan Steels had more loans than India's central government allocation to primary education. Now, I don't think that's a good way to build a company, but, and at least from my RBI perch, regulatory forbearance has never solved a problem. one way to handle a fever is to break the thermometer. The other way is to say that, okay, at least let me keep the thermometer honest, and then let me decide what the medicine is needed. So but many people believe that regulatory forbearance is a very important part of not recognizing losses, and, deferring NPA recognition somehow solves the NPA problem. In my view, it hasn't, but I'm open, and there is a diversity, there is cognitive diversity around this, and so I would say that we again, the most important part of teams who make decisions when you're confronted with uncertainty is cognitive diversity. So just make sure you have. I find the cognitive diversity of policymakers very different from the cognitive diversity we find among business people, right? They think very differently about humans. They think very differently about healthcare, than they think very differently about school than we do. So I think that this is a situation of uncertainty, and we just have to ensure cognitive diversity. Politicians should not be the only people at the table. Bureaucrats should not be the only people at the table. Employers should not be the only people at the table, and employees should not be the only people at the table.
So I hear you there. You talked about how people need to look at their own value systems while arriving at what works best for them. It's an interesting point, because at this point in time, I think there is, from what one can sense, a call for taking decisions in the national interest. Well, I understand businesses need to survive first before they can, kind of guarantee jobs and livelihoods. How does one kind of think about this? Because it's pretty unprecedented. I mean, we've never, because if you do start laying off people, and businesses do start laying off people, it will only make the economic situation even worse than it currently is. So how would you kind of help, us think through this?
I think the 21-day lockdown by employers is substantial down payment on national interest. I think that employers have made the down payments. Now, I think that to expect employers to handle more than a 21-day lockdown with close to zero revenues would not only be unfair, it would be delusional. I mean, 100% of zero is zero. There are many MSMEs who do not have the, the problem with sometimes policymakers is they think that the typical employer is Birla's or Tata's or HDFC or Infosys. While there are 63 million enterprises in India, only 19,500 have a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So let's not think about, the 500 million labor force working in 0.4% of employers. I mean, actually, India's labor is handicapped without capital, and our capital is handicapped without labor. So companies which have money don't actually have that much labor, and the companies that have labor don't actually have that much capital. So it would be unfair to design a recovery program for HDFC, which would apply to a small MSME, which is anyway sort of 90-95% of formal employment. So I think, again, the averaging would hide more than it reveals.
So Manish, here's a question for you, and this is basis conversations that I've been having with quite a few people who fit into the micro enterprise category, who would have 5 to 10 people with them, and much like you said, I mean, they're practically run out of runway and for the best, despite having the best of intent, they don't see themselves surviving post April 15th, and are looking desperately for solutions. Furlough seems to be the only option as far as they're concerned. Now, what advice may you have for them, or how, as a policymaker, how may you view them? What advice may you offer?
Oh, I think it would be patronizing to offer advice. There is really no solution here, unless, of course, I would submit that if 15th April crosses, then I don't think the government can do 8 trillion like US and European governments have done, which is 2 years of profits of their corporate sector. But there would have to be a fiscal package which would involve massive government borrowing, and which would, the decision would be, is the best vehicle for delivering this fiscal package employers, employees, or citizens? So I think that if we go beyond 15th April, and particularly if we go beyond 1st May, there will have to be a fiscal package, whether that's 1 lakh crores, 2 lakh crores, 3 lakh crores, or 5 lakh crores. We can debate that. There will be a fiscal package. Then the debate will be is what is the best vehicle to deliver this? Do you do the Kurzwealth program of Germany, which subsidizes employers and uses them as the vehicle to deliver um, um, succor, or to deliver ease, or do you give it to employees where you credit them in their salary accounts or through their provident fund, or formal employers? But formal employers are only 25% of India's labor force. So do you then, or do you think of something as citizens? But it's a little unfair when people talk about universal basic income, because, you know, if you pay 26% of our people in poverty half our per capita income as universal basic income, you'll need 17% of GDP and you'll wipe out tax receipts. So universal basic income as a concept, we really need, we need direct benefits transfer. We need to target people. We can't give 1.3 billion people income. We don't have those resources, even if we chose to say bust the FRBM. So I think that the advice to companies will be is, stay alive as long as you can, because entrepreneurship is about buying time. If you stay alive, entrepreneurship is staying alive long enough to get lucky. I think that if you stay alive, you can get lucky. There are precedents to that. And so I think that employees will recognize, just like I think if you had sacked people when the lockdown was announced, employees would have been less open, as I said about sequencing. I think on 15th April, employee receptivity to share pain will increase a little bit. And so I think that should be used by those MSMEs to say that, look, it's, 100% of zero is zero. If this company goes, there is nothing there. So let's share some pain on 15th April, and then let's regroup on 1st May to decide what we can do. But it's basically option theory and strategy.
You have another window into this world of economic activity through Teamlease and your, the business side of your engagement with corporates, companies,
Yes.
even MSMEs. What are you seeing as the words being used over there of intent and action? And what are you seeing as the actual steps that people are taking in that world, which employs folks like typically from Teamlease or third-party outsourced resources?
I think they treat March as a month of work. I think because it was 24th March, so everybody has been honorable and honored all their contracts. I mean, we paid 500 crores in salary this month, and it got paid with almost everybody. There are a few people who are doing kit. But I think April, those bets will be off. I think that, the only summation of this is everybody is back to, we will tell you on 15th April what will be the month of April. We don't want to take decisions now because people will panic. We don't want to go either way. We don't know whether the lockdown will be lifted, and nobody knows whether the lockdown will be lifted, and we don't want to announce what we'll do on 15th April today, because if the lockdown is lifted, we actually need to get back to activity very quickly. And I think that there will be a short-term labor shortage or a salary spike between 15th April and 25th April. Or 30th April at the bottom of the pyramid, because there's nobody around and it'll take time for people to come back. So the people who will be around, there will be a wage spike, which employers will be fine with. So I think that, again, all employers are saying, we can't imagine what we will do on 1st May if the lockdown continues, but we do have clear plans to reduce our fixed costs on 15th April. If the lockdown goes on. It's just that simple. I mean, I don't think employee costs are fixed costs for employers anymore. Whether you're contract or third party or direct, or whether you're an employee, I think the pain will have to be distributed across all buckets. You couldn't just say that I'm going to distribute it in this bucket or that bucket. This problem is too big for sort of isolated or discrete solutions.
Conversations which are speculating on the way in which they might want to share the pain with employees or
No, I think somewhere between 15 and 25 to 30 is par for the course already, right? Of 15 to 25 to 30 pay cuts are the ranges, saying that up to below 25,000 people will not get a cut. And above 25,000, based on different algorithms, it'll be somewhere between 15 and 30 or 35% on 15th April. And beyond 1st May, then that will escalate substantially.
Okay, just a last question from me, Manisha. I'm going to move away from the world of economic activity and get to the coronavirus battle and killing the infection. One of the things that's being talked about is the lack of below the doctor healthcare resources available across the country. And that's an area in which you've done phenomenal area of work in skills as well as in making the people who have those abilities ready to be employed and taking them and connecting them with employers and people who have the need for those capabilities. In your experience, therefore, it's important that we get that glimpse. We have about 850, 900 nursing schools in this country. If you take an average of about 100 a batch, 3 years pipeline at the very minimum, degree awarding plus add certifications, others, short-term skill capabilities for healthcare. There is already a base of partial capability available. Do you think that both in terms of policy and in terms of doability, practicality, it would be possible to repurpose these capabilities to be deployed to fight the battle for managing the disease as it hits the hospitals and the ICUs?
Oh, I think in the short run, it will not be possible because just of the lockdown, right, and the real. But what this virus does is reminds us about how behind our skill system is because of the regulatory cholesterol, the apartheid between education and para-skilling. India is not going to be able to make everybody a graduate. So in my mind, I hope this crisis will allow some of the regulatory cholesterol that has partitioned the education and the skill system too substantially. That has held back apprentices to only 3 lakhs instead of 15 million if we should have. The connectivity between the modularity between a 3-month certificate, 1-year diploma and 3-year degree, which should exist, which today is held barricaded. So I don't think we can retool these people in the next 1 month just because of the physical lockdown. And the problem again is like jobs to people or people to jobs. Do you take education to people or people to education? That will become the binding constraint in the short run. But I think that at the end of this virus, I think I will have a much stronger case to all these bureaucrats and to these institutions that have been saying our system has made progress. It has made progress relative to where we were, but we're far from where we can be. And this is not a problem like cancer or climate change or like coronavirus. It's a plumbing problem. Our skill system has a plumbing problem whose outdated plumbing has been totally exposed in this virus. And I'm actually quite optimistic that a policy window for skill reform will open after this calms down, and they will be willing to entertain stuff that they would always say, oh yeah, we need it, but this is not the time. And I think this has brought forward that openness, whether it is para-skilling in medicine, whether it is apprenticeships, whether it is breaking down the barriers between degrees and diplomas, whether it is performance management in ITIs, fear of whether it is fixing short-term employment exchanges, all those agendas, which, one of my challenges in the last few years in government has been, how do you get something done in government after everybody who matters in government agrees with you? And I think that challenge will change, get much easier after this crisis, because they'll have to do more than agree. They'll have to actually, the brain has not been connected to its hands and legs for the government. And that sort of poor nervous system has been exposed in this crisis, because while a chief minister or prime minister may have a certain intention, the beat cop interprets it differently. So I think civil service reform, labor reform, skill reform, banking reform, all the things which we agreed were needed for a $10 trillion economy, we now have had a randomized control trial to prove that we need to accelerate it much more quickly. So the human tragedy is large, the corporate tragedy is large, but I think India needed a little policy jhatka to expose that, the civil service reform. I mean, many Indian civil servants are neither Indian nor civil nor servants, and so they have stood when they were supposed to deliver us what they say they know how to do. We know how to do, and the private sector will show what it can do in this crisis, but we cannot substitute for the state. And the last mile of the Indian state has been exposed in this crisis. So police reform, health service reform will all accelerate in my mind at the end of this crisis.
But that's a function of whether we lose a few million lives here or there.
Oh, I think even with what has the experience of migrants, with the reflection of the Indian state's ability, I mean, I think that people will, and there will be a divergence between people's ranking of top leadership and their experience of the state anyway, right? They'll say, okay, top leadership was bold in its 21, like they say with demonetization, right? They say demonetization was the right thing to do, but it was badly executed. And they gave a pass on that. So I think that this virus, they will say the 21 lockdown was a bold decision, but execution could have been better. Because the human capital at the bottom of the Indian state, I mean, there are only 4,700 IAS officers in India. There are 20 million civil servants, and people's daily experience is the 21 million civil servants. And so all the stuff of performance management, the HR, the government does not have HR. And I think that has been exposed again in this sort of crisis. And I think that whether a few million die or a few thousands die, or on 14th April we go to normalcy, for reformers, the case for reform has become easier.
So there has been, I think, some folks who believe that this has also exposed the highly centralized kind of model of leadership that we followed in managing this crisis, and that it may have been better if there was much better communication between the states and the center, and that states had been allowed to have much more say in the way the lockdown was planned and orchestrated. For the simple reason that there were just too many rules set down from the center, which were complex to unravel, whether, the simple thing of logistics between essential and non-essential movement of logistics, complicated stuff which the center didn't understand. Would it have been better, you think, if he had kind of looked at the implementation a little differently?
Oh, I think 29 chief ministers matter more than one prime minister for India reaching a $10 trillion economy. I think 100 mayors matter more than 29 chief ministers, actually, right? The reality is we don't have city leadership, and that's where the rubber meets the road. India, there's no such thing as India's labor markets. There is some such thing as Karnataka's or Kerala's labor market, or UP's labor market, which is an export labor market, is different from an import labor market like Maharashtra. So there may be some such thing as India's capital market. So I think the realm of this, I mean, I think postmortems have a certainty that prescriptions don't, which every doctor will say that. And I think one of the looking back on this crisis clearly will be that, yes, cooperative federalism is as important as competitive federalism. But I think the nature of it is that politics will play an important part also in sort of when the way that politics has become so polarized and confrontational. I mean, many chief ministers do not even attend the video conference being done. They send their ministers, or they send finance ministers or stuff like that. So I think spiritually and intellectually, something like the National Development Council, which was conceived at the point of independence. I think India can't be run from Delhi is recognized, right? I mean, Indira Gandhi, in 10 of her speeches, had said, strong states lead to a weak nation. That was the wrong view of the world. So I think that decentralizing funds, functions, and functionaries in normal times is the only way India can develop. In crisis time, the balance is sort of will have to be found better next time around. Absolutely.
Manish, what about civil society participation? How do you look at the whole thing there? You already said that from the business's perspective, the 21-day lockdown is a huge, that itself is a huge contribution. But are there, things that businesses, civil society can do together to ease some of the pain, for the poor? And also, if you look at MSMEs, is there any ecosystem support that larger organizations, which to a large extent depend on them for supplies and so on, can they do? Do you see that happening? Or what do you think will happen in the next few weeks if the lockdown continues beyond April 15th as well? So.
And
I
Manish,
mean, I see all three of us are struggling with our birth defects, right? The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, and non-profits and NGOs have a scale deficit. So I don't think there's any NGO in India which could say, I will help the country at this time. They can say, I will help this state at this time. They will say, I'll help the city at this time. And most of them can just say, I'll help this mohalla at this time, or I will help this person at their time, because NGOs have not invested in what takes to scale. I mean, the plumbing, scaffolding, whatever you want to call it, which corporate India has demonstrated its ability to scale. Many of them have. But nobody trusts corporate India, right? Because of this stupid crony capitalism and 14 lakh crores and bad loans and all the other things. So I think that this crisis, if corporate India is able to sort of after the lockdown is lifted, restore things quickly, get things back to normal, people will realize that we were told to shut down, we shut down, we worked from home, we managed continuity, and then when it opened, we restored operations much more quickly. So I think that, yeah, NGOs and civil society have a very important role, but they also have to recognize that the trust that they are trusted, but they have not invested in the plumbing. The private sector has plumbing, but has lost some of the trust. The government has resources, but it doesn't have execution. So I think all three of us have to overcome our birth defects also by working with each other. I mean, the private sector cannot substitute for the state, and NGOs cannot substitute for the private sector. I mean, lately there's been this expectation that, the private sector can do things that the state is not doing. That's delusional. I mean, we cannot substitute for the state, and we can't do what NGOs do. So I think NGOs scale deficit has also been exposed a little bit in their crisis. Their good heart is obviously always on display, and in areas where they're localized and able to offer the intervention, I mean, we need all hands on deck, so NGOs will really work. But I have a problem with this whole social enterprise thing. I mean, any enterprise which creates jobs and is ethical and honest is a social enterprise. I mean, and social enterprises must be subject to the rigors of scale and sustainability. Usually an enterprise that can't scale or is not sustainable declares itself a social enterprise. My sense is that we need social enterprises in India. All of us are social enterprises. Companies in India have a much more complex view of our stakeholders than US corporations. That's been true for a long time. We realize early in life that we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. So I think there are obviously some black sheep in corporate India, there's some black sheep in NGOs, and there's some very competent and honest and hardworking bureaucrats. So I think that rather than expecting NGOs, private sector, and government to substitute for each other, let's learn how to complement each other, because we all have three birth defects and we all have very unique strengths. The government has resources, we have execution, and NGOs have trust. But NGOs don't have scale, we don't have trust, and the government doesn't have execution. So I think that this is a really good time also for us to reflect on how we complement and can work better together.
Manish, I have a follow-up question to that. Directionally, do you see any initiatives that catch your attention which suggest that this collaborative model between civil society, business, and government coming to the fore? Are you seeing any early examples that look encouraging?
Not yet. I'd say that there is a lot of work between civil society and government, but as of now, private sector, I think for the last 10, 15 days has been distracted with continuity, right? I mean, if this goes on and then they will be able to look up. Right now, they're just, looking to keep their head above the water. But I think that even if it doesn't emerge in this crisis, I think it will emerge post-crisis. I think that in areas like healthcare and education, which turned out to be the most really important parts of, or the most disrupted parts in the virus, whether schools have responded, amazed. I would say I'm amazed with the level of sort of continuity that some of the schools are displaying with their classes, which will then be available as open source to all schools in India. I know most of the leading schools, their lesson plans and their sort of stuff will become available to everybody. I think healthcare protocols, which many hospitals are doing, will also become available to the government. But the challenge of the government is also sometimes dyslexic, right? I mean, it has a learning disability. In terms of even if you give it the best practices or if you give it the playbook, because they don't have HR, they don't have performance management, they don't have org structure effectiveness, they don't have training. So I think the most important thing the government needs to think about is their human capital at the end of this crisis. And with that, the private sector can obviously help them a lot. In terms of just thinking about raising their human capital. We need to replicate the colonel threshold of the army in the civil services. We need to retire people at 50 if they are not performing. 98% of IAS officers are not outstanding, though their official ranking gives them to that. I know the private sector doesn't recognize, or is moving away from bell curves, but with 99% of IAS officers ranked outstanding, there's no performance management possible. So I'd say the most important one could be human capital partnerships between the private sector and government at the end of this.
Interesting. You spoke about also, Manish, about the trust deficit that business faces, corporate India particularly. What sort of opportunities are available today to fix that? Because this crisis certainly provides some of that. I want to kind of take you back to some of the points I think you made at an earlier interview about how there are opportunities to display better strengthen employer brands.
I think corporate India is listening much more than they used to 5 years ago. See, finally, the most dangerous lies are the lies we tell ourselves, right? and I think corporate India is being called out on lies. So I love that movie Two Popes, right? Where the old Pope tells the younger Pope that I need a spiritual hearing aid. I think corporate India has actually found 5 or 6 hearing aids in the last few years and is really transforming. So I think diversification has been destroyed as a strategy. I think most of the companies in IBC are not in IBC because of their core business, they're because of their stupid business. Why would a great media company buy a highway? Why would a cement company, why would a consumer product company buy a cement company? Why would a hospital buy a power plant? So I think the concept of IBC has reminded people that equity is payable when able, but debt is payable when due. Right? I mean, people were they were borrowing their equity, they were stealing their equity. I think that capital structures after IBC, and especially after the SR transition, we needed a real event to happen. I think that if the virus had not happened, IBC would have, 200 companies would have changed hands in the next 24 if the virus had not happened, 200 companies would have changed hands. That will happen anyway. I think IBC is a great hearing aid for companies. I think the diversification of role models is really a great hearing aid for companies. So I think there are 5 or 6 things which have really forcing corporate India to listen. The growth and governance premium in the stock market. Today, you can't explain anything in the stock market other than growth and governance, right? And people and boards and entrepreneurs are asking themselves, well, I want that multiple. And people say, well, the only way you're going to get that is growth and governance. So I think growth and governance in the secondary market is sending huge price signals back to companies. So I'd say that there's corporate India is listening more. Is being forced to listen more, and it is listening more. And on the other side, and the most important fact about corporate India listening more is all of us next generation entrepreneurs own very little of our companies, right? I mean, all the idiots we put in bankruptcy own 65% of their company. Bhavish owns 6% at Ola, Sachin owns 5% at Flipkart, I own 18%. I mean, I can list you, all of us own between 5 and 15% of our 25% of our companies, right?
Sure.
Actually, Jack Ma only owns 9% of Alibaba, Jeff Bezos only owns 14% of Amazon, and Netflix, Reed Hastings only owns 4%. So I think the fact that many of next generation entrepreneurs also don't have control of their companies forces us to listen. And I think that whole notion that, entrepreneurs owning 70% of their companies is actually not a good thing for minority investors. So I think the fact that we can't, and we won't do that because we can't borrow our equity, right?
Right.
I remember one of these guys whom I had met, who is in IBC today, when I came back from business school in '96, and he was late for the meeting. So he said, I've got a 3,000 crore loan disbursal this morning. I'm a cash rich company. I was like, what is he saying? I mean, but if you confuse liquidity with solvency, I think that was, so I would say corporate India there's a new corporate India. We are in the Trishanku phase. The old has not died and the new has not been fully born yet. But I think we're listening more because of the growth and governance premium. We're listening more because of IBC. We're listening more because diversification has been really bad role models. And we're listening more because we own less of our company, so we have to listen.
But Manish, what will this crisis really, at the end of it, if we were to look back, what would constitute good behavior and what would not?
Well, I think a number of people have come to me saying, why, I wish I could be a zero debt company like you today. That's the first thing, that I think leverage as a business model with leverage is not bad, but the levels of leverage, and more importantly, you can't borrow your equity. So I think the direct of the crisis, as we are seeing, unfortunately, great operating companies. I mean, Jet was a classic company of a company which was operationally viable but not financially viable.
Right. But
And
that was from an employment perspective, as an employer, what are the things that they ought to be thinking about, to your mind? Because
I think that having high debt means you can't be resilient. I think at the end of this, employees will evaluate companies as much for performance and productivity as resilience. I think you have to survive in order to succeed. And, that applies to your company too. So I think that while at an individual level, Corona has reminded ourselves of our mortality, I think at a corporate level, it reminds you that companies can plan. Being consistently warm is a better game than being hot or cold. Playing Ludo is a better game than playing snakes and ladders. Ludo is more laborious. You know where you're going. You'll eventually get there. I think in the last 10 years, we just thought that we didn't realize there were more snakes than ladders, and the snakes are longer than the ladders, when you look at the board carefully. And so I think that IBC plus Corona actually makes resilience a discussion in boards and employee evaluation, which will really be good for people who have traditionally thought that, and in the last 5 years were mocked for being lacking ambition or for saying that you don't. I think resilience is as important as performance.
And what about the continuous learning agenda? Because this kind of volatility, I don't think we've ever experienced before. And we're so used to, passing out of business school and forgetting about re-equipping ourselves for the world that we're in. What will change on that, to your mind? Has this shock really made people sit up and take notice?
I think even before the crisis, in a world where Google knows everything, knowing is useless, right? That whole model of 25 years of learning, 25 years of earning, and 25 years of retirement, that train has left the station anyway. Lifelong learning is no longer an option, it's a necessity. And I think companies will recognize that productivity is really the only way you can compete in the long run. And employees will recognize that their productivity comes from their lifelong learning. You can't, it's not about the down payment you made when you were 25, it's about the EMI that you have done. I've read a book a week for 25 years. That makes me, older and wiser, but more dangerous. And I think that therefore all people will recognize in this crisis, whatever algorithm they use for evaluating which employee goes out first, they are evaluating on skills. They are evaluating on whether this guy is going to be able to do another job in the company. So retooling. So I think that the signal to employers will be productivity and, corporate governance, growth and governance is the only way to survive. That only comes from productivity, and productivity comes from employees who recognize that lifelong learning is important. So I think the self-healingness for corporate India between employees and employers, again, the crises don't create new trends, they accelerate existing trends. This was already happening, and I think this brings it forward. And for people like us who believe that there is a new India, there is a new corporate India, we were tired of the old corporate India, which was essentially a clubby place, right? I mean, India has created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. Why didn't we create the world's largest economy? I mean, we created the world's largest democracy, and that was because of our view of human capital. That was because of the regulatory cholesterol. That was because of the low capacity of the state, all of which has been amplified in this crisis. So I've always said that for a $10 trillion economy, we need civil service reform, we need labor reform, we need decentralization, we don't need 52 ministries, and we need sort of civil service reform. I mean, Japan only has 9 ministries. The US has 14, UK has 21. We have 51 ministries and 250 people with the rank of Secretary to Government of India in Delhi. So I think reinventing government, reinventing this is brought forward by the crisis. And if we get over on 14th April, I think that this will accelerate India's we just crossed UK last year. In the next few years, we'll cross France, Germany, and Japan. I mean, US and China have broken ahead and far ahead of us, but India and China had the same per capita GDP in 91, and now they're 3 times us. There's nothing cultural about that gap. That gap was friendly fire, and that gap was self-imposed. And I think this crisis will accelerate some of the long-term reforms which were pending, because if we were more formalized, if we were more financialized, if we were more industrialized, and if we had higher human capital in this crisis, we would have handled the crisis better. That's all we can learn from it. I mean, we don't know how the next virus will come from somewhere else, but India can be more resilient. Our labor markets can be more resilient. Policy will have more room if we are more formalized, if we are more industrialized, if we are more, our credit to GDP ratio is 50%. It has to go to 100%. Companies would have more working capital, they would have more resilience, right? Not the stupid Bhushan Steel's model, but financialized. So I think formalization, financialization, industrialization, and human capital will be accelerated by this crisis because it has been proven to be our weak point.
Manish, a question here. It's a very interesting point you make on India's regulatory cholesterol, on purging the regulatory cholesterol out here, and the learning curve being accelerated. That's a very good thing to happen. And the question to you here is that as this learning curve accelerates and as India moves 15 years ahead, this is much needed. And I was in conversation earlier this week with an entrepreneur who has been watching this. And one observation that he made when I pointed this out to him, that why ought this not happen? He pointed out to what happened in Surat, for instance. And he said, that it is not that this awareness is not there in the system. The system in Surat, for instance, moved. The government moved, the system changed, but at an individual level, after the panic subsided, the citizens, they settled, they went back to their equilibrium. So there was a certain shift in the needle, but while some shifts happened, it was not good enough. Is it possible or his submission was that change in India takes a very, very long time. Now, is
Because
that
of cultural reasons, is it?
for
I mean,
cultural
because
reasons? Yes.
well, cultural explanations are at best the soft bigotry of low expectations and at worst racism. It took 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 66 million Britishers, not because of the Hindu rate of growth, or some Hindu philosophy, because of regulatory cholesterol, because of human capital, because of lack of urbanization, financialization. I mean, see, cultural explanations break down, right? Because if you remember Krishna Raj's Hindu rate of growth, 2% of growth from 1820 to 1950, India grew at 0.1%. From 1950 to 1991, India grew at 2.7%. So he called it the Hindu rate of growth. But from 1991 till now, we've grown at 7%, and we didn't shoot all the Hindus, right? So I think that maybe that explanation was a little incomplete. So I would submit that what we take as cultural explanations actually break down when people confront the infrastructure of opportunity. India's problem has been our infrastructure of opportunity has been sabotaged by regulatory cholesterol. I mean, India's employer regulatory cholesterol is 57,000 compliance items every year. No, so my case is that India's regulatory cholesterol, and we have put a website out because after fighting with Amitabh and the government, they said, you give these numbers, you have no proof of it. So we put out a website called teamleasecompliance.com, which we update 9 times a day with changes to rules or circulars or laws. And it lists out the 57,000 compliances and 3,100 filings. So you can go and verify it now. So now they've stopped countering with me, say, you are but this is insane. I mean, 50. So I would say that the cultural response of India to say that regulatory arbitrage is a good business model, or borrowing your equity is a good business model, was in response to the situation that we confronted. See, animals bred in captivity find it hard to live in the jungle, right? So all the old corporate India is disappearing. And I would say this coronavirus has exposed many civil servants for what they are. They are incompetent. I mean, it's just basic competence. If you promise us that you can't keep us safe in a crisis, I mean, you have not made us prosperous, but if you can't even keep us alive, then we're going to really have a different view of you. So I would say that don't go down the path of cultural explanations. If we were more financialized, urbanized, industrialized, and had higher human capital, we would have been more resilient in this crisis, and we would have been ahead of Japan, France, and Germany. And this crisis, like anything else, is a tragedy, but it reframes our thinking. It reframes what boundaries were. These are. It has changed our view of many things. It won't change we won't all work from home, and commercial real estate will no longer go away, as some people are saying. But I do think it will accelerate technology adoption in education. And I do think it will hold the state to a higher standard. So they will be more open. UGC will be more open to online degrees, which they have banned for the last 5 years. Now how can they ban it? I mean, that ban has to be, I have written them at least 30, 40 letters, made 40 presentations. Now they don't have a leg to stand on, right? Because Coursera registered 50,000 degree students in the last 6 months from India. They can't stop Coursera from ranking their degree students. Why are they stopping me? So I'd say that this crisis will accelerate India's. Surat, as you gave an example, responded to a plague. India will respond to a virus. So if you're saying that Surat worked, then then India, the coronavirus may have been a push to the inertia of government that may not have happened with any amount of advocacy or article writing or screaming or television shows that could have happened. I think countries don't change for a better option. They change when they have no option. Let's just accept that.
Yeah, so one thing which makes me feel after hearing this conversation is that as Dr. Fauci says, right, that not even the Prime Minister can dictate the timeline. So isn't it inevitable that this is gonna extend much more beyond, because the only country who's seems has overcome it, China, we haven't even seen full evidence that would there be a resurgence, etc. So it seems that, of course, we are, as you say, we are feeling the next pressure of migrants going back and economic trouble. But if we are reactive to, the sort of the biases in human behavior at this stage, are we sort of giving rise to a bigger problem? Because after a point of time, if we open up our economy too early just to not confront those problems, is there a bigger problem which is surely out of our hands, going to force our hand and take us back several years?
I mean, I think that April 14th decision will be a controversial decision, whichever side it goes. I think that there will be no right answer on April 14th on whether it was the right time to lift it or not to lift it. This is not about, this is a trade-off that will have to be done. But my sense is nobody knows right now the right answer, right? So if you're saying that will it be too late to do fiscal response to it? I mean, it would be very easy to announce a 5 lakh crore sort of Jan Dhan credit or some form of credit right now. But I would say it's premature. I would say let's decide whether the lift off on 14th April is partial, it's extended, or it is ended. And then based on that, there should be another phase of announcements from the fiscal, which obviously will have to be targeted at the poorest citizens and keeping infrastructure going. So if you're saying that, so you made 2 points. One is, we shouldn't wait and we should take more policy measures. My sense is, I think we should wait till 14th at least, and then we should announce policy measures. The second point is, well, don't lift the lift off because we don't know what we'll be dealing with. I'm sure that could be a case, but it's hard to imagine a country with a per capita income of $2,000 surviving a 2-3 month lockdown. So then we are in uncharted territory anyway. So there are no good choices here. There are only choices between bad and worse choices, and there are risks that will have to be taken. You may conclude from your vantage that those risks were reckless or they were unnecessary. But as you will discover when you deal with policy, where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. People react to different things, and you have to synthesize it based on some notion of crowdsourcing, which politicians are better at than technocrats, by the way. I mean, I know there is a whole, at the end of this, I hope someday to, write about in defense of democracy. I know people don't like politicians, but technocrats are not exactly. The quantitative easing of central banks in the US is really one of the reasons why the degrees of flexibility in the financial system globally right now and why it is so febrile. So, and that was purely a technocratic decision. So this concept of should decisions be made by technocrats or should they be made by democracies is also an interesting question. But I think the lockdown decision will be made by medical professionals. But they will have to take some inputs from everybody else, because just like war, teaching is too important to be left to teachers, and war is too important to be left to generals. I think that this lockdown decision is too important to be left to medical professionals, even though they have the most important place at the table and the loudest voice.
I think we've taken a lot of Manish's time, and this has been a fantastic session. Really superb, Manish. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Inshallah, 14th is what there will be a wise decision on 14th. Obviously, Anmol's definition of wise. Obviously, Anmol's definition of wise is different than mine, as should be. Okay. Take care. See you then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.